When Silas Rowe arrived at the address of his mail-order bride, he found nothing but silence and shadows. The woman who'd promised him a future had vanished without a trace. But on that cold porch, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, lay a baby girl, abandoned, helpless, and utterly alone. The note pinned to her basket contained only 5 words that would change his life forever. Her name is May, please. What happened next would test everything he believed about duty, love, and what it truly means to become a father. Stay with me until the end of this journey and comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far May's story travels across this world. The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 hours ago, but Silas Rowe's hands still trembled from the journey, not from the cold that cut through the Colorado wilderness, nor from the brutal 2-week trek that had left his body aching in places he'd forgotten existed. No. His hands shook from something far more dangerous than physical exhaustion. They shook from hope. Hope was a treacherous thing for a man like Silas. At 37 years old, he'd learned to live without it. The blacksmith's trade had given him strong arms and a steady income, but it had also given him a back that screamed by nightfall and hands covered in scars that told stories he'd rather forget. The furnace heat had long ago burned away whatever softness he might have once possessed, leaving behind only the practical and the pragmatic. Until her letter arrived. Clara Wynne. Even her name sounded like music when he read it aloud in his empty room above the smithy in Independence, Missouri. Her words had been simple, almost plain, but something in them had reached through the page and touched a part of him he thought had died years ago. I am not looking for romance, she had written in that first letter. I am looking for partnership, for steadiness, for a man who understands that life out here is hard, but that hard doesn't mean hopeless. I have a small cabin near Ridgway, Colorado. It's not much, but it's mine. If you're willing to work, to build something real, to face the mountains and the winters and the loneliness together, then perhaps we might make something of this life. Yours in earnest hope, Clara Wynne. Silas had read that letter 17 times before he'd finally picked up a pen to respond. He wasn't a man of words. His letters were clumsy, full of crossed-out phrases and awkward sentences, but Clara hadn't seemed to mind. Her responses came regularly, every 2 weeks like clockwork, each one revealing a little more about the woman who'd placed that advertisement in the matrimonial news. She was 32, never married. She'd come west with her brother 5 years ago, but he died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with the cabin and 40 acres of stubborn mountain soil. She raised chickens, kept a vegetable garden, and did sewing work for the wives of ranchers and mine foremen. She was practical, she said. She didn't believe in fairy tales, neither did Silas, which was perhaps why her letters felt like something he could trust. For 6 months, they'd written to each other. 6 months of carefully composed sentences and slowly lowered guards. She told him about the way the aspens turned gold in September, how the first snow always came earlier than expected, how the silence of the mountains could either break you or make you whole. He told her about the rhythm of the forge, the satisfaction of shaping raw iron into something useful, the way he'd learned to find contentment in small things, a well-made horseshoe, a properly balanced blade, a job finished right. And then, in her last letter, she'd written the words that had set him on this journey. I think it's time we met. Come in November, before the heavy snows make the passes impassable. I'll be waiting. We'll see if the people we've been on paper match the people we are in life. If they do, perhaps we'll make it official before the justice of the peace in town. If they don't, well, at least we'll know. Either way, I'll have supper ready. Clara. Simple. Direct. No false promises, no romantic illusions, just the honest possibility of 2 lonely people finding something better than loneliness. Silas had sold nearly everything he owned. The smithy's tools went to his apprentice, a capable young man who'd been ready to take over for years. His furniture, his books, even the bed he'd slept in for a decade, all sold or given away. He'd packed only what would fit in a single trunk: clothes, his father's pocket watch, a Bible his mother had given him, and the bundle of Clara's letters tied with string. The journey west had been long and brutal. He'd taken the train as far as Denver, then hired a wagon to carry him into the mountains. The driver, a grizzled man named Hector, with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes that had seen too much, had grown quieter the higher they climbed. You sure about this? Hector had asked as they'd passed through one of the narrow mountain cuts, sheer rock faces rising on either side. Winter's coming early this year, can feel it in my bones. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. I'm sure, Silas had said, though his stomach had tightened at the desolation spreading before them. Miles of pine forest, broken only by bare granite peaks that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient god. Woman must be something special to bring a man all this way, Hector had observed, spitting over the side of the wagon. I hope so, Silas had replied quietly. I surely hope so. Now standing in front of the cabin that was supposed to be his future, Silas felt that hope beginning to curdle into something darker, something that tasted like ash and felt like falling. The cabin was dark. Not just empty dark, but abandoned dark. The kind of darkness that settles into a place when no one has lived there for weeks, maybe months. The windows were blank eyes, reflecting nothing. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. And there was no smoke from the chimney, no smoke on a November evening when the temperature was already dropping toward freezing. Ma'am? Silas called out, his voice sounding too loud in the vast silence. Miss Wynne? It's Silas Rowe. I've come from Missouri, like we discussed. Nothing. Not even the wind answered him. He approached the porch slowly, his boots heavy on the packed earth. The front step creaked under his weight, and he noticed how the wood had begun to rot at the edges. How long since anyone had maintained this place? Clara? He knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed into emptiness. Are you home? When no answer came, he tried the handle. It turned easily, too easily. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. Silas hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Clara was supposed to be here, waiting. There was supposed to be lamplight and warmth, the smell of supper cooking, maybe a nervous smile as they met face to face for the first time. Instead, there was only darkness and the smell of dust and abandonment. He was about to step inside when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A tiny mewling cry, weak and desperate like a wounded animal. Silas froze, his heart suddenly pounding. The sound came again, stronger this time. Not an animal, something else. He turned slowly, scanning the darkening landscape. The cry came once more, and this time he could locate it, somewhere to his left, near the corner of the porch. That's when he saw the basket. It was tucked against the cabin wall, partially hidden in the shadow of the porch overhang. A simple wicker basket, the kind used for carrying eggs or bread from the market. But inside was something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. A baby. For a moment, Silas couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. He stood there, rooted to the porch, staring at the impossible sight before him. The baby cried again, a thin, pitiful sound that cut through his paralysis like a blade. Silas stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the basket. His hands, those scarred, calloused blacksmith's hands that had shaped iron and steel, now trembled as they reached toward the tiny form wrapped in what looked like a faded blue blanket. It was a girl. He could see that much even in the failing light. She couldn't have been more than a few months old, tiny, impossibly fragile, with a face red from crying and tiny fists that waved weakly in the cold air. Lord have mercy, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. What in God's name? He looked around desperately, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could explain this. But there was nothing. Just the empty cabin, the darkening forest, and the first stars beginning to appear in the deep blue sky above. His eyes fell on a piece of paper pinned to the blanket. With shaking fingers, he unpinned it and held it up to catch the last of the daylight. The handwriting was familiar. It was Clara's. He'd seen it dozens of times in her letters. But these words were rushed, almost frantic, so different from her usual careful script. Her name is May. She is innocent of everything. Please protect her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There was no other way. C.W. That was all. No explanation, no context, just those desperate words and a baby girl who was now crying harder, her small body shaking with cold and hunger and fear. Silas stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Clara had never mentioned a baby, Not once in 6 months of letters. How could she have hidden something like this? Why would she? And where was she now? The baby's cries were growing weaker, and Silas realized with a jolt of horror that she was freezing. The temperature was dropping fast, and the thin blanket was barely enough to keep her warm. He didn't think. There was no time for thinking. He scooped the basket up, holding it against his chest as he stood. The baby weighed almost nothing. Too little, some instinct told him. She should weigh more than this. "It's all right," he heard himself saying, though he had no idea if it was all right or if anything would ever be all right again. "I've got you. You're safe now." The door to the cabin still stood open, and Silas carried the baby inside. It was dark, but he could make out the basic shape of the room: a table, chairs, a cold fireplace. He fumbled in his pocket for the matches he always carried and managed to light an oil lamp sitting on the table. The warm glow revealed a space that confirmed his worst fears. The cabin hadn't been lived in for weeks, maybe longer. There was dust on every surface, and when Silas touched the stove in the corner, it was stone cold. The few dishes visible were clean but covered in a film of neglect. A shawl hung on a peg by the door, frozen in mid-sway like a ghost. But there were signs of hasty departure. A chair was overturned by the table. Papers were scattered across a small desk in the corner. And most tellingly, the door to what must be the bedroom stood open, revealing drawers pulled out and empty, as if someone had packed in a hurry. Clara had fled. That much was clear. But why? And why had she left the baby behind? May, if that was truly her name, was crying continuously now, a thin wail that spoke of hours, maybe days, of neglect. How long had she been out on that porch? How long had she been cold and hungry and alone? The thought made something crack open inside Silas's chest, something that hurt worse than any burn from the forge ever had. "All right, little one," he said, setting the basket on the table and carefully lifting the baby out. She was so light, so small, fitting in his large hands like a bird. "Let's get you warm first, then we'll figure out the rest." His movements were awkward. He'd never held a baby before, never had reason to. But there was something instinctive about it, too. Something that told him to support her head, to hold her close to his chest where his body heat could warm her. He got the fire started with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life working with flame. There was wood stacked by the hearth. Clara had at least prepared that much before she left. Within minutes, he had a decent blaze going, and the temperature in the cabin began to rise. May's cries were weakening, which worried him more than the crying itself. She needed food, but what did you feed a baby? Milk, certainly, but from where? The cabin was bare of supplies. Silas wrapped May more securely in his own wool coat, creating a warm cocoon around her tiny body. She quieted slightly, her cries becoming soft whimpers. Her eyes, a dark blue-gray that reminded him of storm clouds, looked up at him with an expression that seemed far too ancient for such a young face. "I don't know what I'm doing," he told her honestly, "but I'm going to figure it out. I promise you that." With May tucked against his chest, Silas began to search the cabin more thoroughly. He needed to find something, anything, that might explain what had happened here. The bedroom was as empty as he'd feared. The wardrobe stood open, bare except for a few old dresses that looked like they'd been considered and rejected. The bed was made but covered in dust. A small chest at the foot of the bed contained linens and nothing more, but the desk in the main room proved more valuable. Among the scattered papers, Silas found several sheets covered in Clara's handwriting. They appeared to be drafts of letters, some to him, others to people he didn't recognize. He gathered them carefully, bringing them back to the table where the lamplight was stronger. Most were mundane, orders for sewing work, correspondence with a merchant in town about supplies. But then he found one that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Garrett, I have told you repeatedly that I cannot pay what you demand. The debt was my brother's, not mine, and he is dead. I have given you everything I can spare and more. I have nothing left. Please, I beg you, leave me in peace. There must be some mercy in your heart. Clara Wynne." The letter was dated 3 months ago. It had never been sent, or perhaps Clara had written a cleaner copy and this was just a draft. Either way, it painted a disturbing picture. Silas found another letter, this one more recent. "I can't do this anymore. Every day I wake up expecting to find him on my doorstep, Every night I lie awake listening for footsteps. He says he owns everything, the land, the cabin, even me, if I can't pay. He says there are ways I could settle the debt that don't involve money. The way he looks at me, I can't stay here. I won't, but I can't take her with me. If he finds me with her, he'll use her against me. He'll hurt her to get to me. The only chance either of us has is if I disappear and she... God forgive me, but I have to trust that someone will find her, someone good, someone who won't let him take her. Please, God, let it be someone who can protect her. Let it be someone who can give her the life I can't. This letter was dated just a week ago. It too appeared to be a draft, or perhaps just Clara writing to herself, trying to make sense of an impossible decision. Silas sat down heavily in one of the chairs, May still cradled against his chest. His mind was reeling, trying to piece together the story from these fragments. Clara had been in debt, or rather, her dead brother had left her with debt. Someone named Garrett was collecting, and apparently his methods were less than honorable. Clara had been frightened enough to flee, but she'd had a baby. May. And Clara had believed that May would be safer left behind than taken along, which raised the most important question. Who was May? Silas looked down at the baby in his arms. She'd finally stopped crying, exhausted by her ordeal. Her eyes were closed now, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths that worried him. Whose child are you? He asked softly. Are you Clara's daughter, or someone else's? The baby, of course, didn't answer. She just slept, trusting him completely in the way only an infant could trust, without question, without doubt, simply because he was there, and he was warm, and he'd stopped the cold. Silas felt something shift inside him, something fundamental and irreversible. This wasn't what he'd come here for. He'd come looking for a wife, for partnership, for a chance at a different kind of life. Not this. Not an abandoned baby, and a mystery that already smelled like trouble. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to take May into town tomorrow, explain the situation to the authorities, and let them handle it. He could still turn around, go back to Missouri, return to his smithy, and his simple, lonely life. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't his responsibility. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, Silas knew he wouldn't follow them, couldn't follow them, because May was looking up at him now with those storm cloud eyes, and somewhere in the past hour, without him realizing it, she'd become his responsibility. Maybe she'd become his responsibility the moment he'd heard her cry. Maybe even before that, maybe from the moment Clara had pinned that note to her blanket and whispered a prayer that someone good would find her. Your mama made a choice, Silas told May quietly. Maybe it was the right choice. Maybe it wasn't. But she chose to trust that whoever found you would take care of you, so that's what I'm going to do. May made a small sound, something between a sigh and a whimper. She was still too cold, still hungry, still in need of a dozen things Silas didn't know how to provide. But he would learn. He would figure it out. Because the alternative, leaving her alone, abandoning her the way Clara had been forced to, was unthinkable. The fire was burning well now, and the cabin was warming up. Silas stood, keeping May close, and checked the kitchen area more carefully. He found a few cans of preserved vegetables, some flour that was probably stale, and mercifully, a small jar of honey. Honey. That was something. Babies could have honey mixed with warm water, couldn't they? Or was that wrong? Silas couldn't remember. He'd heard someone mention it once, maybe, but he'd never had reason to pay attention. First thing tomorrow, he told May, we're going into town. We're going to find someone who knows about babies, because Lord knows I don't. He mixed a small amount of honey with some warm water from the kettle he'd put on to boil. Using his finger, he let May suck the mixture off his fingertip. She took it eagerly, her tiny mouth working hungrily at the sweetness. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. It would keep her alive until morning. When May had taken all the honey water she would, Silas wrapped her in every soft thing he could find in the cabin. Blankets, shawls, even a tablecloth that looked clean. He built up the fire until it roared, then settled into a chair he'd pulled close to the hearth. May lay in his arms, finally warm, finally quiet. Her eyes drifted closed, and her breathing began to slow into the deep rhythm of true sleep. Silas watched her in the firelight, this tiny, fragile thing that had been left in his care, this innocent life that had become his responsibility through no choice of his own. May, he said softly, testing the name. Is that really your name, or did your mama just call you that in a moment of desperation? The baby slept on, oblivious to his questions. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the pines and rattling the shutters. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be below freezing by midnight. If Silas hadn't arrived when he did, if he'd been delayed even another day. He pushed the thought away. She was alive. She was warm. That was what mattered now. But as the night deepened and the fire burned low, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Clara's letters had spoken of danger, of debts and threats, and a man named Garrett who thought he owned everything. What would happen when this Garrett learned that Clara was gone? Would he come looking for her? Would he come looking for May? Silas looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, at her perfect, innocent face, and felt something fierce and protective rise up inside him. It was a feeling he'd never experienced before, primal and powerful, burning hotter than any forge fire. I don't know what's coming, he told May in a whisper. I don't know what kind of trouble your mama was running from, or whether it'll follow you here. But I'll tell you this, little one. Whoever wants to hurt you is going to have to go through me first. And I might just be a blacksmith, but I know how to make things that can't be broken. I know how to stand my ground when the fire gets hot. May stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around his finger with surprising strength. That small gesture, that unconscious act of trust, sealed something inside Silas. A decision that couldn't be undone. A commitment that went deeper than words. He'd come west looking for a life partner. He'd found something different instead. He'd found a daughter. The word felt strange in his mind, foreign and frightening and somehow exactly right all at once. Daughter. The fire popped and crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, the vast Colorado wilderness stretched out under a sky full of cold stars. It was a hard land, an unforgiving land, a land that had broken countless people who'd come seeking new beginnings. But Silas Rowe had worked with hard things his whole life. He'd spent decades shaping iron and steel, taking raw, unyielding materials and transforming them into something useful and strong. If he could do that with metal, perhaps he could do it with this life too. Perhaps he could take this broken situation, this abandoned cabin, this mysterious danger, this tiny abandoned child, and forge something good from it. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. But sitting there in the firelight with May sleeping trustfully in his arms, Silas felt that dangerous thing stirring again in his chest, that treacherous, foolish, necessary thing. Hope. Dawn was still hours away. The night would be long, and May would likely wake crying before morning. There were 100 problems that needed solving, a dozen questions that had no answers, and at least one serious threat lurking somewhere in the shadows. But for now, in this moment, there was just a man and a child, and a fire burning warm against the darkness. And sometimes, in this hard world, that was enough. Sometimes, that was everything. Silas closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He kept watch through the long mountain night, listening to May's breathing, feeling the tiny rise and fall of her chest against his, and making silent promises in the darkness. He would protect her. He would give her a home. He would be what she needed him to be, even if he had no idea what that meant yet. The mail-order bride he'd come to find had vanished, leaving behind only questions and danger. But she'd also left behind something infinitely more precious, a life that needed saving, a soul that needed shelter, a child that needed a father. Silas Rowe had traveled 1,000 miles to find a new beginning. And here it was, sleeping in his arms, weighing almost nothing but changing everything. The empty house wasn't empty anymore. It was full of responsibility, full of uncertainty, full of a future that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He held May closer as the fire burned down to embers, and somewhere in the depths of that long, cold night, a blacksmith became a father, and an abandoned baby became his whole world. The first gray light of dawn found Silas still awake, still holding May against his chest. His arms had gone numb hours ago, but he hadn't dared move for fear of waking her. She'd stirred twice during the night, whimpering softly until he'd given her more of the honey water mixture, and each time it had taken longer to soothe her back to sleep. Now, As pale morning light began to filter through the cabin's dusty windows, he could see just how fragile she truly was. Her skin had a grayish pallor that worried him, and when he gently touched her cheek, it felt too cool despite the fire he'd kept burning all night. The blankets around her were damp. She'd soiled herself at some point, and Silas had no idea what to do about it. He'd never felt more inadequate in his entire life. "We need help," he told her quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "I don't know what I'm doing, little one, but I know someone in town will." May's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. For a moment they seemed to focus on his face, and Silas could have sworn he saw recognition there, as if she understood that this stranger, with the scarred hands and worried eyes, was all that stood between her and the cold. He stood carefully, his back protesting after a night spent motionless in the chair. The fire had burned down to ash and embers, and the cabin temperature had dropped considerably. Silas laid May gently in her basket, rewrapping her in the driest blankets he could find, then set about building up the fire again and heating water for washing. The morning routine of caring for May was a comedy of errors that would have been funny if it hadn't been so desperately serious. Silas had no idea how to change an infant, no idea what to clean her with or how to keep her from crying while he fumbled through the process. He ended up using strips torn from one of the old dresses in Clara's wardrobe, warming them by the fire first, and doing his best to be gentle as he cleaned May's tiny body. She cried through the whole ordeal, her wails echoing off the cabin walls and piercing straight through his heart. But when it was done and she was dry and wrapped in fresh cloth, she quieted somewhat, her eyes finding his face again with that same solemn, trusting expression. "There now," Silas said, lifting her back into his arms. "That wasn't so terrible, was it?" "Well, maybe it was. But we're both still alive, and that counts for something." He gave her more honey water, watching anxiously as she sucked it from his finger. It wasn't enough. He could see that clearly. She needed real milk, and soon, or she'd grow weaker. He needed to get to town, needed to find help, but the thought of taking her out into the cold November morning made his stomach clench with worry. Still, there was no choice. Staying here wouldn't solve anything. Clara was gone. The cabin was nearly bare of supplies, and May needed more care than Silas could provide alone. He wrapped May in every warm thing he could find, creating a cocoon of blankets inside the basket, then pulled on his own coat and hat. The morning air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside, sharp and thin and brutally cold. Frost covered everything, turning the world into a landscape of silver and white. His breath came out in thick clouds, and he pulled May's basket closer to his chest, trying to shield her from the worst of it. The walk into Ridgeway took nearly an hour. The road was rough, more of a track, really, winding through stands of pine and aspen that stood like silent witnesses to his struggle. May cried intermittently, her wails weak and pitiful, and each one made Silas walk faster despite the burning in his legs and lungs. When the town finally came into view, he could have wept with relief. Ridgeway wasn't much, maybe 24 buildings clustered along a single main street, with scattered houses and cabins spreading out into the surrounding hills. But there was smoke rising from chimneys, and the warm glow of lamplight in windows, and the blessed promise of people who might actually know how to help. The first person he encountered was an old man sweeping the boardwalk in front of what appeared to be a general store. The man looked up as Silas approached, his eyes widening when he saw the basket. "Help you, stranger?" the old man asked, his tone wary but not unfriendly. "I need—" Silas's voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat. "I need someone who knows about babies, someone who can tell me what to do. Please." The old man's expression shifted from wariness to concern. He leaned his broom against the wall and stepped closer, peering into the basket. "Lord have mercy. Where'd you get a baby at this hour of the morning?" "It's a long story," Silas said. "Right now she just needs help. She needs milk and warmth and someone who knows what they're doing, because I surely don't." The old man studied Silas for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he nodded, seeming to come to some decision. "You want Mrs. Odell. She's the baker's wife, lives above the bakery just down the street. Yellow door, can't miss it. She's raised 7 children of her own and helped birth half the babies in this town. If anyone can help you, it's Laura Odell." Thank you, Silas said, the words feeling inadequate for the relief flooding through him. Thank you so much. He found the bakery easily. The warm smell of fresh bread was like a beacon in the cold morning air. The yellow door was just where the old man had said it would be, on the side of the building leading up to the second floor. Silas knocked, then knocked again when no one answered immediately. A woman's voice called out from inside, "Hold your horses! I'm coming!" The door swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s with flour on her apron and gray hair escaping from a bun. She was short and round, with the kind of face that looked made for smiling, though right now it wore an expression of puzzled irritation at being disturbed so early. "We don't open until—" she began, then stopped abruptly when she saw the basket in Silas's arms. "What in heaven's name?" "Please," Silas said, and was horrified to hear his voice break. "Please, ma'am, I don't know what to do. She needs help. I don't know how to take care of her." Mrs. Odell's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The irritation vanished, replaced by brisk efficiency and genuine concern. "Get inside," she ordered, stepping back to let him through. "Quickly now, before she catches her death in this cold." The apartment above the bakery was warm and bright, filled with the lingering smell of baking bread and cinnamon. Mrs. Odell led Silas to a kitchen table and immediately took the basket from his arms, setting it down and beginning to unwrap May's layers of blankets. "How long has she been without proper care?" Mrs. Odell asked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined May. "I don't know," Silas admitted. "I found her last night, on the porch of a cabin outside town. She was in the basket with a note, that's all. I've been trying to keep her warm and give her honey water, but I don't think it's enough." Mrs. Odell looked up sharply. "Honey water? Lord above, you could have killed her. Babies can't have honey. It can make them sick." At the stricken look on Silas's face, her expression softened slightly. "But you didn't know that. And she's alive, so no harm done. What cabin? Whose baby is this?" "Clara Wynn's place," Silas said. "At least, that's where I found her. The note said her name is May." Mrs. Odell's hand stilled on May's wrappings. "Clara Wynn," she repeated slowly. "Well, that explains some things and raises a whole lot more questions. You'd better start from the beginning, Mr. Rowe. Silas Rowe. Well, Mr. Rowe, you'd better tell me the whole story while I take care of this poor child." So Silas told her. About the letters, about traveling west to meet Clara, about finding the cabin empty and May abandoned on the porch. He showed her the note that had been pinned to May's blanket and described the scattered papers he'd found inside, suggesting Clara had fled from some kind of debt collector named Garrett. Mrs. Odell listened intently while her hands worked with sure, gentle movements, cleaning May and wrapping her in fresh cloth she produced from a cupboard. When Silas finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her expression troubled. "I knew something was wrong with Clara," she finally said. "She stopped coming to town about a month ago. Before that, she'd been getting thinner, more nervous, jumped at shadows. But she never said anything about a baby, and I never saw any sign of one when I visited her place back in the summer." "So May isn't Clara's?" Silas asked. "I don't see how she could be," Mrs. Odell said. "Unless Clara hid a pregnancy completely, which seems unlikely in a town this small. And this baby is too young, 3 months old at most. That would mean Clara was pregnant when she stopped coming to town, and I would have noticed. No, this child came from somewhere else." "Then where?" Silas asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Whose daughter is she?" "That," Mrs. Odell said grimly, "is a very good question. One I suspect is connected to whatever trouble Clara was running from." She finished with May and lifted her carefully. "Now, this little one needs milk immediately. Real milk, from a nursing mother, or at least from a cow. Mrs. Brennan just had a baby 2 months ago and is still nursing. She lives 3 houses down. I'll send my husband to fetch her while I get some warm goat's milk into this child. You sit down before you fall down, Mr. Rowe. You look like you haven't slept in a week." Silas wanted to protest, to stay close to May, but his body betrayed him. The moment he sat in the chair Mrs. Odell indicated, exhaustion crashed over him like a wave. He watched through heavy-lidded eyes as the older woman heated milk and began to feed May with a small cloth soaked in the liquid, letting her suck the milk from it. May took to it eagerly, her tiny hands coming up to grasp at the cloth. The improvement in her was almost immediate. Color began to return to her cheeks, and her cries quieted to small, contented sounds. "There's a fighter in this one," Mrs. Odell said approvingly. "She's been through hell, poor mite, but she's got strength in her." The door opened and a large man with a flour-covered apron came in, followed by a younger woman with tired eyes and a baby on her hip. "Laura says you need help with a baby?" the younger woman asked, her voice soft and lilting with some kind of European accent. "Emma, thank God," Mrs. Odell said. "This is May, and she's been without proper care for at least a day, maybe longer. Can you nurse her?" Emma Brennan didn't hesitate. She handed her own baby to Mr. Odell and came to take May from his wife. "Poor little angel," she murmured, settling into a chair and arranging her shawl. "Of course I'll feed her. There's always enough." Silas turned away, giving the women privacy, and found himself face to face with Mr. Odell, a bear of a man with kind eyes and a jaw that suggested he didn't suffer fools. "Paul Odell," the man said, extending a flour-dusted hand. "You've caused quite a stir this morning, Mr. Rowe." "I didn't mean to," Silas said, shaking his hand. "I just needed help." "And you came to the right place," Paul said. "Though I suspect you've stepped into something more complicated than a simple case of an abandoned baby. Clara Wynne didn't just disappear, she ran. And if what Laura tells me is true, she ran from Marcus Garrett." The name sent a chill through Silas. "Who is he?" Paul's expression darkened. "Trouble in a fancy coat. Calls himself a businessman, but he's more of a vulture. He came to Ridgeway about 2 years ago, started buying up debts from folks who'd fallen on hard times. Then he'd collect, with interest that would make a bank blush. People who couldn't pay found themselves losing their land, their homes, everything. And Clara owed him money? Her brother did, Mrs. Odell interjected from across the room. Thomas Wynne got himself into debt gambling and borrowed from Garrett to cover it. Then Thomas died in that mine collapse, and Garrett decided Clara was responsible for her brother's debts. She'd been trying to pay him for over a year, giving him every spare penny from her sewing work. But it was never enough. He kept adding interest, kept raising the amount owed. "That's not legal," Silas said. Paul Odell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Legal doesn't mean much out here, Mr. Rowe. Garrett's got connections. The sheriff in the county seat is his cousin, or so he claims. And he's got men who enforce his will, big men, mean men, the kind who don't mind breaking a few bones to make a point." Silas felt his hands curl into fists. He threatened Clara. "More than threatened," Mrs. Odell said quietly. "Near the end, before she stopped coming to town, she had bruises. Said she'd fallen, but we all knew better. Garrett was getting impatient, and Clara was running out of ways to pay. The pieces were starting to come together in Silas's mind, forming a picture that made his blood boil. So she ran. But why leave May behind? If May isn't her daughter, whose is she?" The room fell silent. Emma Brennan looked up from where she was nursing May, her eyes troubled. "There are rumors," she said softly, "about Garrett, about the kind of man he is. Some say he has arrangements with women who can't pay their debts, women who disappear for a while and then come back changed, broken." Silas felt sick. "Are you saying "We don't know anything for certain," Mrs. Odell said firmly, "but if May is connected to Garrett in some way, then Clara did the right thing by hiding her. That man is not fit to be near any child, let alone one that might be—" She trailed off, leaving the terrible possibility hanging in the air unspoken. May had finished nursing and was sleeping peacefully in Emma's arms, her tiny face relaxed and content for the first time since Silas had found her. Looking at her now, so innocent, so completely unaware of the dark circumstances surrounding her birth, Silas felt that fierce protectiveness surge through him again. "What happens now?" he asked. "What do I do?" "You?" Paul Odell raised his eyebrows. "You planning to stick around, Mr. Rowe?" "Someone has to take care of her," Silas said, "and Clara left her in my care. She chose to trust me with May's life, even if she didn't know me. I can't just walk away from that." Mrs. Odell smiled for the first time since Silas had knocked on her door. "You're a good man, Mr. Rowe, but taking care of a baby is no small thing. Where will you live? How will you provide for her?" The cabin, Silas said. Clara's cabin. Someone should be there, should maintain it. If Clara ever comes back, she won't, Paul said bluntly. If she ran from Garrett, she's not coming back. That man doesn't forget debts or grudges. Then the cabin needs someone anyway, Silas insisted. I'm a blacksmith by trade. I can set up a forge, take on work. The town must need a smith. We do, Paul admitted. Old Henry Morrison was our smith, but he died last spring. We've been making do, sending work down to Denver when we absolutely need it, but it's expensive and takes time. Then I'll stay, Silas said. I'll fix up the cabin, set up my forge, and take care of May. It's what I came here to do anyway, build a life, make a home. The circumstances are just different than I expected. Emma Brennan stood carefully, bringing May over to Silas. She's sleeping now, the poor thing. She'll need to eat again in a few hours. I can come by the cabin this evening to feed her again, and I can teach you how to prepare milk for her in the meantime. Silas took May into his arms, marveling at how much more peaceful she looked now, warm and fed and cared for. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. All of you. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You would have figured it out, Mrs. Odell said kindly. Any man who spends all night keeping a baby warm and tries to feed her even if he does it wrong, well, that's a man with the right instincts. The rest is just learning. But you need to understand something, Mr. Rowe, Paul said seriously. If you're staying, if you're taking responsibility for this child, you need to be prepared for trouble. When Garrett hears about May, and he will hear because nothing stays secret in a town this small, he's going to come asking questions. And if he thinks May is connected to him in any way, let him come, Silas said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. I've dealt with hard things before. I'm not afraid of bullies, no matter how big they think they are. Paul studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you mean that, but Garrett's not just a bully. He's dangerous. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't do anything stupid. Well, I promise to protect May, Silas said, whatever that takes. Mrs. Odell packed a basket with supplies, while Emma wrote out detailed instructions for preparing milk and caring for an infant. By the time Silas left the bakery, the sun was fully up and the town was coming to life around him. People stared as he passed, whispering to each other, and Silas realized that by nightfall, everyone in Ridgeway would know about the stranger who'd appeared with a baby and claimed Clara Wynn's abandoned cabin. Let them talk. He had more important things to worry about. The walk back to the cabin seemed shorter with May sleeping contentedly against his chest and his arms full of supplies. The morning was growing warmer, and patches of blue sky were appearing between the clouds. By the time he reached the cabin, Silas was actually feeling something like hope. He spent the rest of the day making the place livable. He cleaned every surface, scrubbing away the dust and neglect. He organized Clara's scattered belongings, finding a few more letters that painted a clearer picture of her desperation. He reinforced the door and checked the windows, making sure they could be secured. And he set up a corner for May, using the basket as a cradle and arranging blankets to keep her warm. Emma Brennan came as promised that evening, bringing her own baby and her husband, a quiet man with gentle hands who helped Silas carry in more wood for the fire. Emma fed May again and showed Silas how to heat goat's milk to the right temperature, how to soak cloth and let May suck the milk from it until she was old enough for a bottle. You're doing well, Emma said as she prepared to leave. Most men wouldn't even try. Most would have just taken her to town and left her for someone else to deal with. That thought never occurred to me, Silas said honestly. Emma smiled. I know. That's why May is lucky to have found you. After they left, Silas sat by the fire with May in his arms, practicing the feeding technique Emma had shown him. May took the milk eagerly, her tiny hands grasping at his finger, and when she was done, she looked up at him with those storm cloud eyes and made a soft, contented sound. We're going to be all right, Silas told her. I don't know how yet, but we will. I'll learn to take care of you proper. I'll set up my forge and make a living. We'll turn this cabin into a real home, and if anyone tries to hurt you or take you away, they'll have to go through me first. May yawned, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O, and closed her eyes. Silas settled back in his chair, watching the fire and listening to May's soft breathing. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, less empty. There was life here again, and purpose, and the beginning of something that might become family. He thought about Clara, wherever she was, and hoped she'd found safety. He thought about the man named Garrett and the threat he represented. And he thought about the future, uncertain and daunting and full of challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But mostly, he just held May and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope this time, but belonging. The sense that after years of drifting, of working hard but building nothing that mattered, he'd finally found his place. It wasn't the life he'd come west to find. It was better. Outside, night was falling over the mountains, bringing with it the cold and the darkness and all the unknowns that lurked in shadow. But inside the little cabin, there was warmth and light, and a blacksmith learning to be a father to a baby girl who'd been left in his care. And that, for now, was enough. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that Silas had never known before but quickly came to depend on. The days began with May's soft cries just before dawn, her small voice pulling him from whatever restless sleep he'd managed to catch. He'd learned to wake instantly at that sound, his body responding before his mind fully surfaced from dreams. He'd warm the goat's milk Emma had taught him to prepare, test it carefully against his wrist the way she'd shown him, and then settle into the rocking chair he'd repaired to feed May while the first gray light crept through the windows. Those quiet morning hours became sacred to him. May would drink her fill, her tiny hands wrapped around his finger with surprising strength, her eyes, growing brighter and more alert each day, fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel both humbled and terrified by the weight of responsibility she represented. After feeding, he'd change her, a process he'd become marginally less incompetent at, though she still managed to surprise him with her timing more often than he'd like to admit. Then came the work. Silas had found an old lean-to behind the cabin that had probably housed chickens at some point, and he'd begun converting it into a makeshift forge. It wasn't much, nothing compared to the well-equipped smithy he'd left behind in Missouri, but it was functional. He'd scrounged materials from abandoned claims and bought what he couldn't find from the general store on credit that Paul Odell had vouched for. The town needed a blacksmith badly enough that people were willing to wait for payment until Silas could establish himself. Word spread quickly. Within a week of setting up his forge, Silas had more work than he could handle. Broken wagon wheels, damaged plows, tools that needed sharpening or repair. The backlog of work that had accumulated since old Henry Morrison's death meant that Silas often worked late into the evening, the glow of his forge visible from town, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoing across the valley. May stayed with him during these work hours, bundled in her basket near the forge where it was warm but not too hot. He'd rigged up a covering to keep sparks away from her, and he'd learned to work with one eye always on her sleeping form, ready to stop mid-strike if she stirred. The neighbors had been more than kind. Emma Brennan came by twice daily to nurse May, and Mrs. Odell stopped in most afternoons with food and to check on them both, often staying to watch May while Silas finished urgent work. "You're building something good here," Mrs. Odell had said one evening, watching Silas shoe a horse while May slept nearby. "The whole town's talking about it. The silent blacksmith who appeared out of nowhere with a baby and asked for nothing but a chance to work." "I'm not silent," Silas had protested, though he knew what she meant. He'd never been one for idle conversation, and between the work and caring for May, he had little time for socializing. "Maybe not," Mrs. Odell had smiled, "but you let your actions speak louder than words. That counts for something out here." What she didn't say, but what Silas felt in the careful way people watched him, was that the town was waiting to see what would happen when Marcus Garrett returned from wherever his business had taken him, waiting to see if the quiet blacksmith would really stand his ground when trouble came calling. Silas tried not to think about it. He focused on the work, on May, on building a life that felt real and solid. But in the quiet moments, when May slept and the fire burned low, and he sat alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in the eye of a storm, that the peace he'd found was temporary, borrowed, fragile as glass. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning in early December. Silas was working at his forge, repairing a set of hinges for the church door, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. Not the usual single rider or farmer's wagon, but multiple horses moving at a deliberate pace. He straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his forehead, and turned to see 3 men riding up the track toward his cabin. The man in the center was immediately recognizable from the description Silas had heard around town. Marcus Garrett sat his horse like a man who owned the world and was merely tolerating its existence. He was younger than Silas had expected, mid-30s perhaps, with carefully groomed dark hair, a coat that probably cost more than most people in Ridgeway earned in a year, and eyes that were cold and calculating as a snake's. The two men flanking him were clearly hired muscle, big, hard-faced men with guns visible at their hips and expressions that suggested they'd be happy for an excuse to use them. Silas set down his hammer carefully and moved to stand between the riders and the cabin door, where May was sleeping inside. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. Years of working the forge had taught him to keep calm when dealing with fire and hot metal. He applied that same discipline now. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice level. Garrett dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his men. He walked forward slowly, his boots barely making a sound on the hard-packed earth, his eyes taking in everything: the forge, the cabin, Silas himself, with an assessment that felt invasive. "You must be the infamous Silas Rowe," Garrett said. His voice was smooth, educated, with just a hint of mockery threading through it. "The man who's been living in my property." "This is Clara Wynn's property," Silas said. "I haven't heard that it belongs to anyone else." Garrett's smile was thin and sharp. "Clara Wynn owes me a considerable sum of money. Her brother's debts, you understand, plus accumulated interest. When someone owes me money and can't pay, their assets become my concern. This cabin, the land, everything on it, it all goes toward settling that debt." "Clara's gone," Silas said. "You can't collect a debt from someone who's disappeared." "Oh, I'm aware she's run off," Garrett said, his tone suggesting this was merely a minor inconvenience. Cowardly, really, but understandable given her circumstances. However, her debts remain, and I have every intention of collecting. He moved closer, and Silas had to resist the urge to step back. There was something predatory about Garrett, something that made Silas think of wolves circling wounded prey. "But I'm not here about the cabin," Garrett continued. "Not primarily, anyway. I'm here about the child." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. "What child?" Garrett's smile widened, showing teeth. "Please, Mr. Rowe, don't insult my intelligence. The entire town is buzzing with the story of how you arrived to meet your mail-order bride and found an abandoned baby instead. Very touching, very dramatic, but that baby belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Silas said, his voice hardening. "She's a child, not property." "Semantics," Garrett waved a hand dismissively. "The child was left in my cabin, on my property. That makes her my concern. I'll be taking her with me today." "No." The word came out flat, final, with no room for negotiation. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance that someone was actually refusing him. "I don't think you understand your position, Mr. Rowe. You have no legal claim to this child. You're a stranger who's been squatting in someone else's cabin for less than a month. I, on the other hand, am a property owner and businessman with connections throughout this territory. If I say the child comes with me, the child comes with me." "Over my dead body," Silas said quietly. The two hired men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their guns. Silas was acutely aware that he was unarmed, that he was outnumbered, that if this turned violent, he would almost certainly lose. But he didn't move, didn't back down, didn't let any of that fear show on his face. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then laughed, a sound without any real humor. "You know, I almost admire your stupidity. It takes a special kind of fool to stand up to me when you have absolutely no leverage. But let me make something very clear, Mr. Rowe. That child is connected to business interests of mine. Her existence raises questions I'd rather not have raised. Her presence here is inconvenient. So whether you hand her over willingly or my associates here convince you to be more cooperative, the end result will be the same." "Why?" Silas asked. "What is she to you? Is she your daughter?" Something flickered across Garrett's face, too quick to read, but it might have been anger. "What she is or isn't to me is none of your concern. All you need to know is that I want her, and what I want, I get." "Not this time," Silas said. "May stays with me." May, Garrett repeated, his voice taking on a musing quality. Is that what you're calling her? How sentimental. Did Clara leave that name, or did you choose it yourself? Silas didn't answer. He could hear May stirring inside the cabin, making the small sounds that meant she was waking up. In a few minutes, she'd start crying for her feeding. The thought of this man, this cold, calculating predator, anywhere near her made Silas's hands curl into fists. Garrett must have noticed the movement because his smile returned. You're thinking about fighting, aren't you? Please do. I haven't been entertained in weeks, and watching a blacksmith try to brawl with two professional enforcers would certainly break up the monotony of my day. I'm thinking about the law, Silas said, forcing his hands to relax. Whatever you think you're owed, whatever claim you think you have, there are proper channels. Courts, judges, legal proceedings. You can't just take a child because you feel like it. Can't I? Garrett asked, his voice soft and dangerous. You're new here, Mr. Rowe, so let me educate you about how things work in this territory. The sheriff is my cousin. The judge in the county seat owes me favors. The lawyers in Denver know better than to cross me. If I want to take that child, there's no law that will stop me. Then you're going to have to take her by force, Silas said, because I won't give her up. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Garrett's hired men were watching their employer, waiting for the signal to act. Silas could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his expression calm, his stance ready. Then, unexpectedly, Garrett stepped back. You know what? I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give you 24 hours to reconsider your position. Think about it carefully, Mr. Rowe. Think about what you're risking for a child who isn't even yours. Think about whether this foolish nobility is worth your life, because that's what you're wagering. He turned back toward his horse, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. If you're thinking about running, about taking the child and disappearing the way Clara did, don't bother. My reach extends far beyond this little town. I will find you, and I will make you regret making me expend the effort. Garrett mounted his horse with the same fluid grace he'd dismounted with. 24 hours, Mr. Rowe. Use them wisely. The three men rode off, moving at that same deliberate pace, leaving Silas standing alone in front of his forge, with his whole body trembling from the adrenaline that had been flooding his system. The moment they were out of sight, Silas's legs nearly gave out. He made it to the cabin door and pushed inside, where May was fully awake now and beginning to fuss. He picked her up with shaking hands, holding her against his chest, feeling her solid warmth anchor him back to what mattered. It's all right, he told her, though his voice wasn't quite steady. I won't let him take you, I promise. But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. What could he really do against a man like Garrett? A man with money, connections, and no apparent conscience? Silas was just a blacksmith, a nobody who'd wandered into town less than a month ago. He had no legal claim to May, no family connections, no wealth to hire lawyers or bribe officials. All he had was stubborn determination and a promise made to a sleeping baby in the middle of the night. Was that enough? He spent the rest of the morning in a daze, going through the motions of caring for May, while his mind raced through possibilities. He could run, take May, and disappear into the mountains, head for Denver or further. But Garrett's threat about his reach had sounded genuine, and besides, running meant abandoning everything Silas had started to build here. He could fight, literally or figuratively, but against three armed men, he'd lose. And even if by some miracle he won that confrontation, it would just bring more trouble down on him. Or he could try to make this legal somehow. Find a way to claim May officially, go through whatever channels existed for adoption or guardianship. But that would take time, and Garrett had only given him 24 hours. Emma Brennan arrived for May's midday feeding and immediately sensed something was wrong. What happened? She asked, taking one look at Silas's face. He told her about Garrett's visit, about the threats and the ultimatum. By the time he finished, Emma's face had gone pale. That man is evil, she whispered. Pure evil. I've heard stories. Women who couldn't pay their debts and then just disappeared. Or came back wrong, broken inside. If May is connected to him somehow, she trailed off, holding May a little tighter. I won't let him have her, Silas said. But how will you stop him? Emma asked. He's right about having connections. The law out here bends toward whoever has the most money and influence. Then I need to find a different kind of law, Silas said. Something that matters more than money. After Emma left, Silas made a decision. He saddled the horse he'd bought the week before, a sturdy mare that had belonged to old Henry Morrison and was sold cheap to help Silas establish himself. He bundled May carefully in blankets, fashioned a sling to hold her against his chest, and rode into town. His first stop was the church. Reverend Samuel Price was a lean, weathered man in his 60s who'd been serving Ridgeway's small congregation for over 20 years. He was weeding the small garden behind the church when Silas found him. "Mr. Rowe!" The Reverend straightened, his face showing concern when he saw May bundled against Silas's chest. "What brings you here in such a hurry?" Silas explained the situation quickly, watching the Reverend's expression grow darker with each detail. "Marcus Garrett is a blight on this town," Reverend Price said when Silas finished. "I've preached against men like him from the pulpit, though I've never named him specifically, but I'm not sure what I can do to help you legally." "I don't need legal help right now," Silas said. "I need moral authority. I need witnesses who can testify to my character, who can stand up and say that I've been caring for May properly, that she's thriving under my care, that taking her from me would be wrong regardless of what the law says." The Reverend's eyes sharpened with understanding. "You're planning to make this public, to force Garrett's hand where people can see." "I'm planning to make it impossible for him to take her quietly," Silas said. "Whatever happens, it needs to happen in the light of day, where everyone can see what kind of man he really is." Reverend Price smiled slowly. "You know, I was supposed to preach about charity this Sunday, but I think perhaps I'll talk about justice instead, and what it means to protect the innocent." He held out his hand. "You have my support, Mr. Rowe, and my testimony, if it comes to that." Silas's next stop was the general store, where he found Paul Odell tallying inventory while his wife helped a customer. "We need to talk," Silas said quietly. Paul took one look at his face and nodded. "Let me finish with this customer. Wait in the back." 5 minutes later, they were in the Odell's private sitting room, with Laura Odell joining them after closing the store temporarily. Silas explained about Garrett's visit and his ultimatum. "That snake," Laura said, her face flushing with anger. "I knew he'd come eventually, but I'd hoped we'd have more time to prepare." "Prepare how?" Silas asked. "To make you part of this community," Paul said. "To make it clear that you're not just some stranger passing through, but one of us. It's harder to intimidate someone when they have a whole town standing behind them." "Can we do that in 24 hours?" Silas asked. Paul and Laura exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. Then Laura smiled, a fierce, determined expression that transformed her grandmotherly face into something formidable. "We can certainly try," she said. "Paul, close the store. We need to make some visits." What followed was a whirlwind afternoon that Silas would remember for the rest of his life. The Odells took him from house to house, cabin to cabin, introducing him to neighbors he'd barely met and explaining his situation. At each stop, the response was similar. Initial surprise, then growing anger, then firm declarations of support. The Brennans pledged to testify about May's health and Silas's care of her. The farmer whose plow Silas had repaired spoke about his honesty and skill. The widow whose roof Silas had fixed free of charge told anyone who'd listen about his kindness. Even the town drunk, a man named Chester, who Silas had once pulled out of a snowbank, sobered up enough to declare that Silas was good people and Garrett was a bastard who needs taking down a peg. By evening, when Silas returned to his cabin with May, he felt something he hadn't felt since Garrett's visit. Hope. Not the fragile, fearful hope he'd carried before, but something stronger. Something built on the foundation of community, of people who'd decided that he was worth standing up for. But hope, he was learning, could be dangerous, because it made you believe things might work out, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. He spent that night making preparations. He wrote a letter, clumsy and awkward, but heartfelt, explaining how he'd found May and what she'd come to mean to him. He documented everything he could remember about the circumstances of her abandonment, about Claire's disappearance, about Garrett's threats. He didn't know if it would matter, but he wanted there to be a record. Proof that someone had cared, had tried. May slept fitfully that night, as if she could sense his tension. Every time she woke, Silas was there, soothing her, feeding her, holding her close. He memorized the weight of her in his arms, the sound of her breathing, the way her tiny hand would grip his finger, even in sleep. If tomorrow went wrong, if Garrett came with his men and took her by force, Silas wanted to remember every detail, wanted to carry these memories like armor against whatever came next. Dawn came too quickly. Silas had just finished feeding May when he heard the sound of horses again. His heart sank. Garrett was early, probably hoping to catch him alone and unprepared. But when Silas looked out the window, he saw something he hadn't expected. The horses belonged to Paul Odell, Reverend Price, Emma's husband Thomas Brennan, and at least a dozen other men from town. They dismounted and approached the cabin, their faces set with determination. Silas opened the door, May in his arms, and stared at them in confusion. "We figured Garrett would come early," Paul said. "So we came earlier. You're not facing this alone, Silas. That's not how we do things here." The words hit Silas like a physical blow, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He'd been alone for so long, years of living in solitude above his smithy, of having acquaintances but no real friends, of being the person others depended on but never depending on anyone himself. Now, looking at these men who'd given up their morning's work to stand with him, he felt something crack open inside his chest, something warm and painful and utterly transforming. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Don't say anything," Reverend Price said gently. "Just know that you're not alone. Whatever happens today, we're with you." They didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, Garrett returned with his 2 hired men, riding up the track with the same arrogant confidence he'd shown the day before. But this time, when he arrived, he found not a solitary blacksmith, but a wall of townspeople standing between him and the cabin door. Garrett pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd. His expression didn't change, but Silas saw something flicker in his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation, or the first hint that his carefully laid plans might not proceed as smoothly as he'd expected. "Well," Garrett said finally, his voice carrying across the morning air, "this is quite the reception. I didn't realize I was so popular." "You're not," Paul Odell said bluntly. "We're here for Silas and May, to make sure nothing happens that shouldn't." Garrett's smile was cold. "I appreciate the community spirit, truly, but this is a private matter between Mr. Rowe and myself. It doesn't concern the rest of you." "A child's welfare concerns all of us," Reverend Price said, "especially when someone with your reputation comes making threats." "Reputation," Garrett repeated softly. "Be careful, Reverend. Slander is still actionable in this territory." "Truth isn't slander," the Reverend replied calmly. "And the truth is that you have no legitimate claim to that child, no legal authority, no moral standing, nothing but brute force and intimidation." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "I have Clara Wynn's debt. I have ownership of this property, and I have the law on my side whether you choose to believe it or not." "Then prove it," Paul challenged. "Go through the proper channels, file your claim in court. Let a judge decide who has the right to that baby. But you won't do that, will you? Because you know that in the light of day, with proper scrutiny, your claim won't hold up." For a long moment, Garrett said nothing. His hired men shifted restlessly, hands near their weapons, waiting for orders. The morning air was thick with tension, balanced on a knife's edge between peace and violence. Then Garrett smiled, that same cold, calculating expression that never reached his eyes. "You think you've won something here," he said softly. "You think that standing together makes you strong. But you're wrong. All you've done is delay the inevitable." His gaze fixed on Silas, who stood at the center of the group holding May. "Enjoy your victory, Mr. Rowe. It won't last. Nothing ever does." He turned his horse and rode away, his men following, leaving behind a silence that felt more ominous than any threat. "He'll be back," Thomas Brennan said quietly. "Men like that don't give up." "I know," Silas said, holding May a little tighter. "But at least we bought some time." "More than time," Reverend Price said. "You've made this public now. You've shown the whole town what side you're on and given us a chance to stand with you. That changes things." "Does it change them enough?" Silas asked. Nobody had an answer for that. The answer came 3 days later, delivered by a rider from the county seat who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Silas was at his forge when the man arrived, his hammer ringing against hot iron while May slept in her basket nearby. The rider dismounted stiffly, pulled a folded document from his saddlebag, and approached with visible reluctance. "Silas Rowe?" the man asked, though his eyes had already found May and his expression had grown uncomfortable. "That's me," Silas said, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his apron. "I'm serving you with a legal summons," the writer said, thrusting the papers at Silas. "You're required to appear before Judge Harrison Caldwell at the Territorial Courthouse in 2 weeks' time. The matter concerns custody of the minor child currently in your care." Silas took the papers with hands that had gone cold despite the forge heat. Garrett went to court. "I don't know anything about that," the writer said quickly, already backing toward his horse. "I just deliver the papers. You show up or you lose by default. That's how it works." He was gone before Silas could ask any questions, leaving behind only dust and the official documents that felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Silas read through them slowly, struggling with the legal language. The petition had been filed by Marcus Garrett, claiming guardianship rights based on property ownership and alleging that Silas was an unfit caretaker with no legal standing. The document painted Silas as a drifter who'd illegally occupied Clara Wynn's cabin and appropriated a child who rightfully belonged under Garrett's protection as the inheritor of Clara's outstanding debts. It was all lies wrapped in legal terminology, but it was official. And it was terrifying. May woke and started crying, her small voice cutting through Silas's panic. He set the papers aside and went to her, lifting her gently and holding her close while he tried to think. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to figure out how to fight a man with money, connections, and the law apparently on his side. By evening, word had spread through town. Paul Odell was the first to arrive, followed quickly by Reverend Price, then a steady stream of others until Silas's small cabin was packed with people all talking at once, offering advice and support and anger at Garrett's tactics. "This is good," Paul insisted, raising his voice to be heard over the others. "I know it doesn't feel that way, but this is actually good. He's playing by legal rules now instead of just taking what he wants. That means we have a chance." "A chance at what?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "I have no legal claim to May. I'm exactly what those papers say I am, a stranger who showed up a month ago. What judge is going to choose me over a property owner with connections?" "A judge who sees the truth," Reverend Price said firmly. "A judge who understands that May's welfare is more important than property rights or debt collection." "And if Judge Caldwell isn't that kind of judge," Silas challenged, "if he's another one of Garrett's bought men?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They all knew the risk. The law in these territories was often more about power than justice, and Garrett had made it clear he knew how to use that to his advantage. "Then we make sure the truth is so clear, so well documented, that even a corrupt judge would have trouble ignoring it," Laura Odell said, her voice cutting through the defeated quiet. "We get witnesses. We get testimony. We show that May has been thriving under Silas's care and would suffer if taken away." "How do we prove that?" Silas asked. "She's just a baby. She can't tell them she's happy or safe." "But we can," Emma Brennan spoke up from where she sat nursing her own child. "I've been feeding May twice a day since you arrived. I've watched her go from a half-starved, nearly frozen infant to a healthy, growing baby. That's not nothing, Silas. That's everything." "Emma's right," said Dr. Wilhelm, an elderly German physician who'd arrived late and now stood in the doorway. "I examined the child when you first came to town, though perhaps you don't remember. You were quite distressed at the time. I can provide medical testimony about her condition then versus now. The improvement is remarkable." Silas did remember, vaguely, a blur of those first overwhelming days when strangers had kept appearing to help, and he'd been too exhausted and frightened to keep track of them all. "What about a lawyer?" Thomas Brennan asked. "Surely we need someone who knows the law to speak for Silas in court." "Lawyers cost money," Silas said quietly. "Money I don't have. I've barely been able to pay for supplies and feed myself. Everything I earn goes right back into building the forge and buying materials. Then we take up a collection," Paul said immediately. "Everyone here contributes what they can, the whole town if necessary." "I can't ask you to do that," Silas protested. "You're not asking," Laura said firmly. "We're offering. There's a difference." The meeting continued long into the night, people arguing and planning and offering suggestions until Silas's head spun with possibilities. By the time everyone finally left, he had a list of people willing to testify, a promise of funds to hire a lawyer, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. But lying awake that night with May sleeping beside him, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were all missing something. Some angle Garrett would exploit, some trap they hadn't seen coming. Men like Garrett didn't file legal petitions unless they were confident of winning, which meant he knew something they didn't. The next morning, Silas made a decision. He needed to understand what he was up against, needed to know more about Garrett and his claim to May. And there was only one person who might have those answers. He bundled May carefully and rode into town, heading not to the usual gathering places, but to the small boarding house on the edge of the settlement where the schoolteacher lived. Miss Sarah Chen was a young woman who'd come west from San Francisco 2 years earlier, and according to Paul Odell, she was one of the few people in town who wasn't intimidated by Marcus Garrett. Silas found her grading papers in the boarding house parlor. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Rowe," she said, setting down her pen. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" "Word travels fast in a small town," she said, "especially when it involves court summons and custody battles. Please sit. Tell me what you need." Silas sat awkwardly, May stirring in his arms. "Mrs. Odell said you know things about Garrett. Things other people are afraid to talk about." Sarah Chen smiled slightly. "Mrs. Odell talks too much. But yes, I know things. I make it my business to know things, especially about men who hurt women and children." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Silas said. "Who is May? Why does Garrett want her? What actually happened to Clara Wynne?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying May's sleeping face. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street beyond. "What I'm about to tell you is based on rumors, observations, and things I've pieced together from talking to women who are too frightened to speak publicly," she said. "I can't prove most of it, and if you repeat it, I'll deny saying anything. Understood?" "Understood," Silas said. "Clara Wynne was a good woman in an impossible situation," Sarah began. "Her brother Thomas really did die in a mining accident, and he really did leave her with debts to Garrett. But the amount she owed wasn't nearly as much as Garrett claimed. He inflated it, added impossible interest rates, made it clear the debt would never be satisfied through normal means." "So he wanted something else from her," Silas said, his voice hard. "He wanted her," Sarah said bluntly. "Garrett has a pattern with women who owe him money. He makes offers, work off the debt through special arrangements, become his mistress, entertain his business associates. Women who refuse find their situations getting worse. Accidents happen. Property gets damaged. Threats are made." Silas felt sick. Clara refused him. Multiple times, from what I understand. She was stubborn, proud, determined to pay her debts honestly, but Garrett doesn't accept refusal well. Sarah turned from the window, her expression grim. About 8 months ago, Clara stopped coming to town for several weeks. When she returned, she was different, quieter, more frightened. She wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "He hurt her," Silas said. "I believe so. And I believe that's when May was conceived." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "I can't prove it, but the timing fits. A baby abandoned at roughly 3 months old, Clara disappearing shortly before, her absolute terror of Garrett finding out about the child. It all points to May being the result of assault." Silas looked down at May, sleeping peacefully in his arms, completely unaware of the darkness surrounding her origins. His hands tightened protectively around her. "So Garrett is May's father," he said, the words tasting like poison. "Biologically, possibly," Sarah said, "but that doesn't make him a father in any meaningful sense. It makes him a rapist who's now trying to claim ownership of the evidence of his crime." "Why would he want her?" Silas asked. "Why not just let Clara disappear with the baby and be done with it?" "Because May is proof," Sarah said. "Proof that could be used against him if anyone ever decided to pursue justice. And because Garrett sees everything and everyone as property. The idea that Clara escaped him, that she left behind a child he could have controlled, it offends his sense of ownership." What will he do with her if he wins custody? Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah's expression was bleak. Nothing good. At best, he'll farm her out to some family far away where she can't cause problems for him. At worst, she trailed off, shaking her head. I don't like to think about the worst. Silas sat in silence, processing everything. The story Sarah had pieced together was horrifying, but it made a terrible kind of sense, and it made his determination to keep May away from Garrett absolute. Can any of this be used in court? He asked. Not without witnesses willing to testify, and you won't find those, Sarah said. The women who know the truth are too frightened. Garrett has made examples of people who cross him, and without proof, it's just accusations that could be turned around as slander. So what do I do? Sarah came and sat across from him, her eyes intent. You focus on what you can prove. You can prove that you've cared for May, that she's healthy and safe with you. You can prove that Garrett has no legitimate claim beyond property rights. You can show that his interest in May only appeared after she became publicly visible, suggesting his motives aren't about the child's welfare. You build your case on facts, not on the truth we both know but can't prove. That might not be enough, Silas said. It might not be, Sarah agreed, but it's your best chance. That and one other thing. What? Find Clara Wynne, Sarah said. If she's still alive, if she can be convinced to testify about what happened, about why she left May in your care, that could change everything. How am I supposed to find her? Silas asked. She could be anywhere by now. She could be, Sarah said, but I don't think she went far. I think she's hiding close by, watching, waiting to see if May is safe. Women who give up their children don't just forget about them. They watch from the shadows, praying someone better can give their babies the life they couldn't provide. The words hit Silas hard, making him think of that desperate note pinned to May's blanket. The careful way Clara had wrapped her had left her where someone would find her quickly. The pain that must have been in every choice she made that night. If you're right, how do I reach her? He asked. You don't, Sarah said. You let her reach you. You make it known, carefully, quietly, that you're looking for information about her. That you're not angry, not judging, just trying to understand. That May is safe and loved and you're fighting to keep her. Word will spread. If Clara's anywhere within 100 miles, she'll hear. Silas nodded slowly. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something, more than he'd had before. He thanked Sarah and left, his mind churning with everything she'd told him. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than usual, the December cold biting through his coat, May's weight in his arms a constant reminder of what he stood to lose. Over the next week, Silas threw himself into preparation for the hearing. Paul Odell had found a lawyer in Denver, a younger man named James Morrison, who was apparently old Henry Morrison's nephew and willing to take the case for a reduced fee out of family loyalty, and as he put it in his first letter, pure disgust at Marcus Garrett's continued existence. Morrison arrived a week before the hearing, a thin man in his early 30s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He spent 3 days interviewing everyone in town, taking notes, building what he called a narrative of care and community. Our case is simple, Morrison explained to Silas one evening while May played with a wooden rattle Laura Odell had brought her. We show that you have provided excellent care for May. We show that she has thrived under your guardianship. We show that removing her from your care would be harmful to her welfare. And we show that Garrett's claim is based purely on property rights with no consideration for what's best for the child. What about his connection to May? Silas asked. What if he claims to be her father? Morrison's expression darkened. Has he made that claim officially? Not yet. But if what I've learned is true, don't tell me, Morrison interrupted. If you tell me, I become obligated to address it in court, and without proof, that helps no one. What I will say is this. Even if Garrett were to claim paternity, biological connection doesn't automatically grant custody. We can argue that his behavior, his threats, his history make him unfit regardless of blood relationship. Will that work? In a fair court? Yes, Morrison said. In Judge Caldwell's court? I honestly don't know. Caldwell isn't overtly corrupt, but he's influenced by wealth and status. We need to make our case so compelling that ruling against us would be obviously unjust. The day before they were set to leave for the county seat, Silas received an unexpected visitor, He was finishing the evening feeding when he heard a soft knock at the door. Not the firm rapping of his usual visitors, but something hesitant, almost furtive. He opened the door to find a woman standing in the gathering dusk. She was thin, almost gaunt, with dark hair tucked under a worn bonnet and eyes that darted nervously toward the road. "Mr. Rowe?" she whispered. "Yes," Silas said, something in her manner making him lower his voice to match hers. "I'm Clara Wynne," she said, and then her eyes found May in his arms and filled with tears. "And that's my daughter." Silas stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what was happening. Then instinct took over and he stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Come inside, quickly." Clara slipped in like a shadow, her eyes never leaving May. She moved closer, her hands reaching out, then pulling back, as if afraid to actually touch the baby. "She's grown," Clara whispered. "She's so much bigger than when I left her." "She's healthy," Silas said gently. "She's safe. I've been taking care of her." "I know," Clara said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've been watching, from a distance, but watching. I've seen you with her, seen how careful you are, how gentle, seen the whole town rally around you both." She finally looked up at Silas, her expression full of guilt and gratitude and exhaustion. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't keep her safe, not from him." "Garrett," Silas said. Clara flinched at the name. "You know about him?" "Some. Enough to understand why you ran. But I need to know more, Clara. I need to know the truth, because in 2 days I have to stand in front of a judge and fight for the right to keep May, and I need every piece of truth I can get." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes returning to May. Then, slowly, she began to talk. The story she told was worse than what Sarah had pieced together, more brutal in its details. Garrett hadn't just threatened Clara, he'd systematically destroyed her ability to resist. He'd bought her debts from other creditors, cornered her financially, made sure she had nowhere to turn. And when she'd continued to refuse his advances, he'd taken what he wanted by force. "It happened in my own cabin," Clara said, her voice flat with the kind of pain that went beyond tears. "He came one night with his men, said he was there to collect. When I told him I didn't have the money, he said we'd work out alternative payment. I tried to fight. I did. But his men held me while he—" She stopped, unable to continue. "You don't have to say more," Silas said quietly. "I understand." "I didn't know I was pregnant until it was too late to do anything about it," Clara continued after a moment. "I thought about running then, but I had nowhere to go and no money for travel. So I stayed, hid the pregnancy as long as I could. May came early. I delivered her myself in that cabin, alone, terrified Garrett would find out." "How did you keep her hidden for 3 months?" "I barely left the cabin. Told people I was sick. The few times I had to go to town, I left her with a woman who lives up in the hills, a hermit who asks no questions. But I knew I couldn't keep it up forever. Garrett was getting suspicious, pressing harder for payment, talking about taking the cabin and everything in it. I knew if he found May, he'd either kill her or use her to control me forever." "So you chose to leave her behind," Silas said. "I chose to save her life," Clara said fiercely. "Do you know what it cost me to put my baby in that basket and walk away? Do you know how many times I almost turned back? But I knew if I took her with me, we'd both end up dead or worse. My only chance to give her a life was to disappear and pray that someone good would find her." She looked at Silas again, her eyes searching his face. "And someone did. Better than I could have hoped. When I heard about the mail-order bridegroom who'd claimed my baby as his own, who was standing up to Garrett, I thought maybe God was real after all. Maybe there was such a thing as answered prayers." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Silas asked. "Because I'm a coward," Clara said simply. "Because the thought of seeing him again, of being in the same room with him, makes me want to die. Because I knew that coming forward would mean admitting what happened, making it real and public, and I wasn't strong enough." "What changed?" "I heard about the court hearing," Clara said. "I heard that Garrett was going to take May anyway, that all my sacrifice might be for nothing, and I realized that being a coward was worse than being afraid, that my daughter deserved better than a mother who hid in the shadows while someone else fought her battles." She straightened her shoulders, and despite her worn appearance and obvious fear, there was steel in her spine. "So I'm here," I'm willing to testify. I'm willing to tell the judge everything, to make Garrett face what he did publicly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure May stays with you." "Clara," Silas said carefully, "if you testify, you'll have to face him. You'll have to say these things in front of him, in a courtroom. Are you really ready for that?" "No," Clara said honestly. "I'll never be ready, but I'll do it anyway for May, for the daughter I couldn't keep safe but maybe finally can protect." Silas made a decision then. "Stay here tonight. We're leaving for the county seat at first light. My lawyer needs to hear your story, needs to prepare your testimony, and I think—" He paused, looking down at May. "I think May should spend some time with her mother before we go. Whatever happens, you both deserve that." Clara's face crumpled with emotion. Can I hold her?" "Of course," Silas said, carefully transferring May into Clara's waiting arms. The moment May settled against her mother's chest, something magical happened. May, who'd been fussing softly, went completely still. Her eyes opened and seemed to focus on Clara's face with an intensity that was almost eerie. And then she smiled, the first real smile Silas had seen from her, an expression of pure recognition and joy. "She remembers you," Silas said softly. "She knows her mama," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter close. "Oh, May, my sweet May. Mama's so sorry. Mama's so sorry." Silas turned away, giving them privacy, and found himself having to wipe his own eyes. This was what he'd been fighting for, not just May's safety, but the preservation of this bond, this connection between mother and child. Even if Clara couldn't raise May herself, even if circumstances forced them apart, they deserved this moment of reunion. He prepared a simple meal while Clara sat by the fire holding May, singing to her in a soft voice, telling her all the things a mother should tell her daughter. By the time they ate, May had fallen asleep in Clara's arms, peaceful in a way Silas had never quite seen before. "Thank you," Clara said as darkness fell fully outside, "for taking care of her, for loving her, for being the father I couldn't give her." "I'm not replacing you," Silas said. "If we win this case, I'd want you in her life, however much or little you can manage. May deserves to know her mother." "I don't know if I can stay in Ridgeway," Clara said. "Not with him here. Not after everything." "Then we'll figure something else out," Silas said. "Letters, visits, something. But May should know where she came from. She should know that her mother loved her enough to make the hardest choice possible." Clara smiled through her tears. "I had it all wrong, you know. When I wrote those letters to you, when I thought maybe we'd marry and build a simple life. I thought I knew what I needed, partnership, steadiness, someone reliable. But you're so much more than that. You're good, Silas Rowe, truly deeply good, and my daughter is blessed to have found you." They talked late into the night, Clara filling in details that would help Morrison build the case, Silas learning more about May's early days. When Clara finally fell asleep in the chair by the fire, May still in her arms, Silas watched them both and felt something settle in his chest. Tomorrow, they'd travel to the county seat. In 2 days, they'd stand before a judge and fight for May's future. Garrett would be there with his money and his connections and his cold certainty that he owned everything and everyone. But Silas had something Garrett didn't. He had the truth. He had a community standing behind him. He had witnesses willing to testify, and a mother willing to face her worst nightmare to protect her child. And he had love, not the complicated, conditional kind that came with strings attached, but the simple, fierce kind that would move mountains if necessary. Looking at May sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Silas made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however hard he had to fight, May would grow up safe and loved and free from Garrett's shadow. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, for these few quiet hours, there was only a cabin full of warmth, a sleeping baby, and a mother who'd found her way home. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Silas had barely slept, watching over Clara and May through the night, his mind racing with everything that could go wrong in the coming days. When the first light touched the cabin windows, he rose quietly and began preparing for the journey. Clara woke slowly, still holding May, her face showing the first real peace Silas had seen since she'd arrived. But as consciousness returned fully and she remembered what lay ahead, that peace evaporated, replaced by fear so palpable it seemed to fill the room. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her arms tightening protectively around May. "You can," Silas said gently, bringing her a cup of hot coffee. "You already did the hardest part. You came back. The rest is just words." "Words that will destroy what's left of my reputation," Clara said. "Words that will make everyone in the territory know what happened to me, what was done to me. Words that will protect May," Silas countered. "That's all that matters now." Clara looked down at her daughter, who was just beginning to stir, making small sounds that would soon become demands for breakfast. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I just wish being right made it easier." They traveled in a wagon Paul Odell had lent them, with James Morrison riding alongside on horseback. The lawyer had arrived before sunrise, his expression grim but determined after spending an hour questioning Clara about what she was willing to testify to in court. "It's enough," Morrison had said finally. "More than enough. If she can say even half of this in front of Judge Caldwell, Garrett won't have a leg to stand on." But the "if" was the problem. Clara grew quieter as they traveled, retreating into herself, and by the time they reached the county seat late that afternoon, she was trembling so badly she could barely walk. The county seat was bigger than Ridgeway, but still small by any real measure, maybe 300 people, with a main street of businesses and a two-story courthouse that tried to look imposing but mostly just looked tired. Morrison had arranged rooms for them at a boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions and kept to herself. That evening, Morrison drilled Clara on what to expect, how to answer questions, what Garrett's lawyer would likely try to do to discredit her testimony. With each scenario he described, Clara grew paler, until finally she stood abruptly and rushed outside. Silas found her behind the boarding house, bent over and sick, her whole body shaking. "I can't," she gasped between retches. "Silas, I'm sorry, but I can't face him. I thought I could, but just thinking about being in the same room, having him look at me, having everyone stare while I describe what he did. I can't." Silas knelt beside her, one hand on her back, feeling helpless. "What if you don't have to look at him? What if you just focus on the judge or on Morrison or on me?" "It won't matter," Clara said. "He'll be there. I'll know he's there. And I'll fall apart." She looked up at Silas, her face streaked with tears. "I'm not strong enough. I thought I was, but I'm not." Silas helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "Then we'll find another way." "There is no other way," Clara said bitterly. "Without my testimony, it's just your word against Garrett's money and connections. You'll lose. He'll take May." "Maybe," Silas said, "but I'd rather lose fighting with what we have than win by forcing you to destroy yourself. May wouldn't want that. I don't want that." Clara pressed her face against his shoulder and sobbed. "I'm so sorry, I'm failing her again." "You're not failing anyone," Silas said firmly. "You got her to safety. You gave her a chance at life. That's not failure, Clara. That's love." They stood there in the gathering darkness, Clara crying against his shoulder while Silas held her and tried to figure out what to do next. When Morrison came looking for them, his expression showed he'd already guessed what had happened. "She can't testify," Silas said. Morrison nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. The trauma is too fresh, the fear too raw. Forcing her to take the stand would likely do more harm than good anyway. Garrett's lawyer would tear her apart, and a woman breaking down on the witness stand doesn't always inspire sympathy in male judges." "So what do we do?" Silas asked. Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "We adjust. We focus on what we can prove without Clara's direct testimony. The medical evidence of May's condition when you found her versus now. The testimony of everyone who's seen you care for her. The lack of any legitimate legal claim Garrett has beyond property rights. It's weaker without Clara, but it's not hopeless." "It sounds hopeless," Clara said, her voice muffled against Silas's shoulder. "It sounds like a fight," Morrison corrected, "and I've won worse cases with less evidence. But I need something from you, Miss Wynne. I need you to write down everything you told me earlier, every detail, dated and signed. It can't be used as direct testimony without you on the stand, but I can use it to impeach Garrett if he lies about his relationship to you or May. Can you do that?" Clara pulled back from Silas, wiping her eyes. Yes, I can do that." They spent the rest of the evening with Clara writing page after page in careful script, documenting everything while Morrison asked clarifying questions. By the time she finished, it was after midnight, and they all felt wrung out and exhausted. Silas lay awake in his small room, listening to May's soft breathing from her makeshift cradle, trying not to think about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and full of dark dreams. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived the next morning. Word had spread somehow, probably through Garrett, Silas suspected, and there were far more people present than a simple custody hearing warranted. Silas recognized several faces from Ridgeway, including Paul and Laura Odell, Reverend Price, Emma and Thomas Brennan, and at least a dozen others who'd made the long journey to show their support. But there were also Garrett's people, well-dressed men and women who watched the proceedings with cold interest, their presence clearly meant to intimidate. And there, in the front row on the opposite side of the courtroom, sat Marcus Garrett himself, looking as calm and confident as if he'd already won. His eyes found Silas immediately, then moved to May in Silas's arms, and something flickered across his face, too quick to read, but it might have been possessiveness, or might have been rage. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, who'd entered behind Silas and Morrison, and his expression transformed into something so coldly satisfied that Clara actually stumbled. Silas moved to block Garrett's view of Clara, positioning himself between them. Garrett's smile widened slightly, as if Silas's protective gesture amused him. Judge Harrison Caldwell entered precisely at 9 o'clock, a heavy-set man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and a face that revealed nothing. He took his seat, surveyed the crowded courtroom with what might have been irritation, and rapped his gavel once. "This is a custody hearing, not a theatrical performance," he said sharply. "I'll have order and quiet, or I'll clear this room. Understood?" The murmuring died instantly. Caldwell shuffled papers for a moment, then looked up. "We're here to determine custody of the minor child known as May Wynn. Mr. Garrett has petitioned for guardianship based on property claims. Mr. Rowe opposes this petition and seeks to maintain custody. Mr. Morrison, you're representing Mr. Rowe?" Morrison stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Mr. Garrett, you're representing yourself?" Garrett rose gracefully. "I am, Your Honor. I felt this matter was straightforward enough not to require counsel." "We'll see about that," Caldwell said dryly. "Mr. Garrett, as petitioner, you'll present your case first." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as concern. Garrett presented his case with smooth confidence, painting himself as a reluctant guardian stepping up to protect the interests of a child left on his property. He produced documents showing Clara's debts, papers claiming ownership of the cabin and land, and testimony from his business associates about his sterling character and financial stability. "This is not about desire for custody," Garrett said earnestly, his performance so convincing that Silas might have believed him if he didn't know better. "This is about responsibility. Miss Wynn abandoned this child on my property, making her my legal responsibility. Mr. Rowe, while perhaps well-meaning, is a transient with no legal standing. He occupied my property without permission and appropriated a child who was not his to take. I simply want to ensure the child is properly cared for under lawful guardianship." "Do you intend to raise the child yourself?" Judge Caldwell asked. "I have made arrangements with a reputable family in Denver," Garrett said smoothly. "Good people who can provide stability, education, and opportunities a child deserves. They've agreed to adopt her legally and give her every advantage." It was perfect, Silas realized with growing horror. Garrett wasn't claiming May as his own, wasn't revealing any personal connection that might raise questions. He was positioning himself as the responsible property owner making sensible arrangements for an abandoned child. It was all lies wrapped in reasonable-sounding logic, and from the judge's expression, it was working. When Morrison stood to present their case, Silas could see the lawyer adjusting his strategy on the fly, responding to Garrett's performance rather than delivering the argument he'd prepared. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "Mr. Garrett would have you believe this is a simple matter of property rights and legal responsibility. But this case is actually about a child's welfare and what serves her best interests. May I call my first witness?" Over the next 2 hours, Morrison methodically built his case. Dr. Wilhelm testified about May's condition when Silas first brought her to town versus her health now. Emma Brennan described watching Silas learn to care for an infant, his dedication and gentleness despite having no prior experience. Paul Odell spoke about Silas's character and his integration into the Ridgeway community. Reverend Price testified about the spiritual and moral dimensions of parenthood, arguing eloquently that love and commitment mattered more than legal documents. Through it all, Garrett sat unmoved, occasionally whispering to the man beside him, sometimes smiling slightly, as if the testimony was exactly what he'd expected and planned for. When Morrison finally called Silas to the stand, Garrett's lawyer, or rather, Garrett himself, since he was representing himself, leaned forward with obvious interest. Morrison led Silas through his story gently, letting him describe finding May, the desperate note, the weeks of learning to care for her. Silas spoke from the heart, describing morning feedings and sleepless nights, May's first real smile and the way she'd grown stronger each day. He talked about the terror of not knowing what he was doing balanced against the fierce determination to figure it out. "Why didn't you simply take the child to the authorities when you found her?" Morrison asked. "Because she needed immediate help," Silas said. "Because it was freezing and she was starving and there wasn't time to find authorities. And then, after I'd spent the night keeping her alive, after I'd fed her and held her and promised her she'd be safe, I couldn't just hand her over to strangers. She'd already been abandoned once. I couldn't do that to her again." "But you are a stranger to her," Garrett interjected, ignoring the judge's sharp look at the interruption. "By your own admission, you'd never seen this child before that night. You have no blood relationship, no legal connection, nothing but your own sentimental feelings. Why should your feelings matter more than proper legal channels?" "Because she's not a piece of property to be processed through channels," Silas said, his voice hardening. "She's a child who needed someone to care about her survival more than they cared about paperwork. I became her father that night, not because of blood or law, but because she needed one, and I was there, and I chose to be what she needed." "How noble," Garrett said, his tone making it sound like an insult. "But fatherhood isn't something you simply choose, Mr. Rowe. It's a legal relationship with responsibilities and rights defined by law. You can't just declare yourself someone's father because you spent a few weeks playing caretaker." "Then what makes someone a father?" Silas shot back. "Money, property, legal documents? Or is it showing up every morning when she cries, learning what each different cry means, walking the floor at midnight when she won't settle, counting her breaths to make sure she's still breathing? Is it the fear that grips your heart when she seems too quiet, or the joy when she finally looks at you and smiles? Tell me, Mr. Garrett, which of those things have you done for May?" The courtroom went silent. Garrett's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had gone cold and dangerous. Judge Caldwell rapped his gavel. "Mr. Rowe, you'll refrain from asking questions. That's Mr. Garrett's role during cross-examination." He looked at Garrett. "Which you may begin now if you wish." Garrett stood slowly, buttoning his coat with deliberate precision. He approached the witness stand with the same predatory grace Silas had seen at the cabin. "Mr. Robici, you mentioned that Miss Clara Wynne had been corresponding with you as a prospective mail-order bride. Is that correct?" "Yes," Silas said. "And in all those months of correspondence, did she ever mention having a child?" "No." "Did she mention being pregnant?" "No." "Did she give you any reason whatsoever to expect that you would be arriving to find an infant rather than a bride?" "No," Silas admitted. "So this child's existence came as a complete surprise to you?" "Yes," Garrett smiled. "And yet you expect this court to believe that a woman you'd never met, who'd been writing to you about marriage, simply abandoned her child on a porch with a note and disappeared. Don't you find that story rather convenient?" "Convenient," Silas repeated, anger rising in his voice. "For you, yes," Garrett said smoothly. "You arrive expecting a wife and find instead an abandoned infant. What better way to establish yourself in a new community than to play the hero? The noble stranger who rescued a helpless baby. It certainly seems to have worked. Half of Ridgeway appears to be here supporting you." "That's not what happened," Silas said. "Isn't it? Or is the truth somewhat different? Perhaps Clara Wynne was here when you arrived. Perhaps the child is actually yours, the result of a relationship that predated your supposed mail-order correspondence. Perhaps this entire story is a fabrication designed to hide an inconvenient truth." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Morrison was on his feet objecting, but Garrett spoke over him. Or perhaps Clara Wynne is the one who's lying. Perhaps she was in some kind of trouble, needed to disappear, and created this elaborate story about debts and danger to manipulate a gullible stranger into taking responsibility for her illegitimate child. Have you considered that possibility, Mr. Rowe? That's not what happened, Silas repeated, but he could see the doubt on Judge Caldwell's face the way the accusation had landed. Can you prove it's not? Garrett pressed. Can you produce Clara Wynne to testify to the truth of your story? Can you show any evidence beyond your own word that events transpired as you claim? Silas looked at Morrison, who was still objecting strenuously. He looked at Clara, sitting in the back of the courtroom with her face buried in her hands. He looked at May, sleeping peacefully in Laura Odell's arms near the front. And then he looked at Garrett, seeing the cold calculation in the man's eyes, the certainty that he'd just won. Yes, Silas said quietly. The courtroom fell silent. Garrett's expression flickered with surprise. I can produce Clara Wynne, Silas continued. She's here. She's in this courtroom right now. Morrison's head snapped around. Clara was shaking her head frantically, her face white with terror. But Silas kept his eyes on Garrett, watching the man's careful composure begin to crack. Is she? Garrett said, his voice still smooth but with an edge to it now. How interesting. And yet she hasn't testified. Because she's terrified of you, Silas said. Because you're the reason she ran. Because you're the reason she had to choose between keeping her daughter and keeping her daughter alive. Your Honor, Garrett said sharply, these are serious accusations without foundation. I demand— Clara Wynne, Judge Caldwell interrupted, looking around the courtroom. If you're present, please identify yourself. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Clara stood. She was shaking so badly she had to grip the bench in front of her to stay upright, but she stood. I'm Clara Wynne, she said, her voice barely audible. Approach the bench, Caldwell ordered. Clara made her way forward on unsteady legs. When she passed Garrett, he smiled at her, a cold, possessive smile that made her flinch. But she kept walking until she stood before the judge. Miss Wynne, Caldwell said, his voice gentler than it had been. I understand this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. Is the child in question your daughter? Clara nodded, then seemed to find her voice. Yes, Your Honor. Her name is May. She's 4 months old. And did you leave her on the porch of your cabin for Mr. Rowe to find? Yes, Your Honor. Why? Clara's hands were shaking. She looked at Garrett, then quickly away. Because I couldn't keep her safe. Because there was a man who wanted to hurt me. Who had hurt me. And I knew if he found out about May, he'd use her to control me, or worse. So I had to make him think I'd gone away alone. I had to make him think May didn't exist. And this man, Caldwell said carefully, is he in this courtroom? Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes. Who is he? Clara looked at Silas, and he saw her gathering what remained of her courage. Then she turned, pointed directly at Garrett, and said in a voice that grew stronger with each word, Marcus Garrett. He collected debts that belonged to my dead brother. He inflated them beyond anything I could pay. And when I couldn't pay, when I kept refusing his other offers, he came to my cabin one night with his men, and he forced himself on me. May is the result of that attack. That's why I had to hide her. That's why I had to run. The courtroom exploded. People were shouting, some in anger, some in shock. Garrett was on his feet, his composed mask finally shattered, his face twisted with rage. Judge Caldwell was pounding his gavel, calling for order. These are lies, Garrett shouted over the chaos. Lies from a desperate woman trying to avoid her debts. I never touched her. You did, Clara said, and though tears were streaming down her face, her voice was clear and firm. You did, and everyone in Ridgeway knows it, even if they're too afraid to say so. You did, and May is the proof. You did, and that's why you want to take her away, because she's evidence of what you are. Order! Caldwell roared, slamming his gavel repeatedly. I will have order in this court, or I will clear it. The room gradually quieted, though the tension remained thick enough to choke on. Garrett had regained some of his composure, but his hands were clenched at his sides and his jaw was tight. Miss Wynne, Caldwell said, These are serious accusations. Do you have any proof? I have a written account, Morrison interjected, standing, dated and signed by Miss Wynne, detailing the events she just described. While it cannot substitute for sworn testimony, it corroborates her statement. I object to this entire line of, Garrett began. Your objection is noted, Caldwell cut him off. But Miss Wynne has made her statement voluntarily and under oath. The court will consider it. He looked at Clara. Miss Wynne, if what you say is true, why did you wait so long to come forward? Why allow Mr. Garrett to file this petition before speaking up? Because I'm a coward, Your Honor, Clara said simply. Because I was more afraid of facing him than I was of losing my daughter. It took the possibility of May being handed over to him to make me brave enough to tell the truth. Caldwell studied her for a long moment, then looked at Garrett. Mr. Garrett, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Garrett's face had gone hard and cold. They're completely false, Your Honor. I've never been anything but professional in my dealings with Miss Wynne. She owes me money. That's documented fact. Beyond that, I have no personal relationship with her whatsoever. As for the child, I have no idea who the father is, but it certainly isn't me. Can you prove that? Morrison asked quickly. Can she prove it is? Garrett shot back. Where's her evidence? Where are her witnesses? She makes wild accusations, but she can't prove any of it. She doesn't have to, a new voice said from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She was small and wizened, dressed in worn clothes with long gray hair braided down her back. Silas didn't recognize her, but Clara gasped. Mrs. Alvarez, Clara whispered. The old woman walked forward with slow dignity. Your Honor, I am Maria Alvarez. I live in the hills above Ridgeway. Clara Wynne came to me when she was pregnant, asked me to help deliver the baby when her time came. I helped her hide the pregnancy. I helped her care for the child in secret, and I saw the bruises on her body. I saw what had been done to her. This is highly irregular, Garrett protested. This woman wasn't on any witness list. Neither was Miss Wynne's testimony about assault, Caldwell said sharply. You opened this door, Mr. Garrett, by questioning Mr. Rowe's credibility and Miss Wynne's honesty. Now you'll live with the consequences. He looked at Mrs. Alvarez. You're willing to testify to what you just said? I am, Mrs. Alvarez said firmly. And more. I know of 3 other women in the territory who have similar stories about Marcus Garrett. Women who owed him money and paid in other ways because they had no choice. Women who are too frightened to speak publicly, but who have spoken to me in confidence. Hearsay, Garrett snapped. None of this is admissible. This is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial, Caldwell said. The rules of evidence are more flexible, and frankly, Mr. Garrett, I'm inclined to hear whatever Mrs. Alvarez has to say. He paused, his eyes hard. Unless you'd prefer to withdraw your petition. The silence stretched out. Silas could see the calculation happening behind Garrett's eyes, weighing his options, measuring the damage. Finally, Garrett's shoulders relaxed slightly, and that cold smile returned. I think we've heard enough testimony, he said smoothly. I'll withdraw my petition, Your Honor. Clearly, this matter is more complicated than I initially understood. In the interests of the child's welfare, perhaps it's best that she remain with Mr. Rowe for now. How generous of you, Caldwell said dryly. But I'm not finished. Mrs. Alvarez, please approach. What followed was an hour of testimony that painted a damning picture of Marcus Garrett's behavior in the territory. Mrs. Alvarez spoke carefully, never making direct accusations she couldn't support, but weaving together a pattern of exploitation and abuse that was impossible to ignore. She produced letters from 2 of the women she'd mentioned, women who'd moved away but were willing to have their experiences documented. She described Clara's condition when she'd first come seeking help, the bruises, the shock, the terror. Through it all, Garrett sat rigid and silent, his expression giving nothing away. But Silas noticed his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When Mrs. Alvarez finished, Judge Caldwell sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his expression grave. I'm prepared to make my ruling, he said. But first, Mr. Garrett, I want to be very clear about something. You came into my court today claiming to care about a child's welfare, but everything I've heard suggests your only interest in this child is as leverage or liability. Whether the specific allegations against you are true or not, and I have my suspicions, it's clear that placing this child in your custody would not serve her interests. Your Honor, Garrett began. I'm not finished, Caldwell cut him off. You've withdrawn your petition, which means I don't have to rule on the merits. But I want it on record that had you not withdrawn, I would have denied your petition without hesitation. Mr. Rowe may be an unconventional guardian, and his legal standing may be questionable by strict interpretation, but he has demonstrated genuine care for this child's welfare. That matters more to me than property rights or debt collection. He turned to Silas. Mr. Rowe, I'm granting you temporary custody of May Wynn for a period of 6 months. During that time, you'll work with a lawyer to file proper adoption papers. Miss Wynn, you'll need to formally surrender your parental rights or work out some custody arrangement with Mr. Rowe. If at the end of 6 months everything is in order, I'll make the arrangement permanent. Understood? Yes, Your Honor, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Don't thank me, Caldwell said. Thank your community for standing with you. And thank Miss Wynn for having the courage to tell her truth. He looked at Garrett. As for you, Mr. Garrett, I suggest you examine your business practices carefully. I'll be sending a letter to the territorial marshal about what I've heard here today. How he chooses to investigate is up to him, but I suspect you'll be receiving some unwelcome attention in the coming months. Garrett stood, his movements rigid with barely controlled fury. Is that all, Your Honor? That's all, Caldwell said. You're dismissed. Garrett walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, his hired men following behind him like shadows. The moment the door closed behind him, the courtroom erupted in cheers and celebration. Silas made his way to Clara, who'd collapsed into a chair and was sobbing. He knelt beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said gently. You stood up to him. You told the truth. I almost didn't, Clara said through her tears. I almost ran again. If Mrs. Alvarez hadn't appeared, but she did, Silas said. And you were brave when it mattered most. May will know that someday. She'll know what it cost you to protect her. Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears, but somehow lighter than Silas had ever seen it. Can I hold her? Before you take her back to Ridgeway, can I just hold her once more? You can hold her whenever you want, Silas said. We'll figure out the details, but Clara, you're her mother. That doesn't change just because circumstances forced you apart. Whatever arrangement we work out, May will know you love her. Laura Odell brought May over, and Clara took her daughter in her arms, holding her close and whispering things only a mother should say. May, awake now, looked up at Clara with those storm cloud eyes and reached out a tiny hand to touch her mother's face. The ride back to Ridgeway took most of the day, but Silas barely noticed the time passing. He felt lighter than he had in months, as if some enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The fear that had been his constant companion since finding May was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Clara rode with them part way, then split off toward a small settlement to the west where Mrs. Alvarez lived. She'd decided to stay with the old woman for a while, to heal and figure out what came next. But before she left, she'd made arrangements to visit May in Ridgeway once a month, and she'd promised to write letters that Silas would read to May as she grew older. Tell her I love her, Clara said as she prepared to ride away. Every day, tell her that her mother loves her. I will, Silas promised. And when she's old enough, I'll tell her the whole story. I'll make sure she knows what you sacrificed to keep her safe. Clara smiled through fresh tears, kissed May's forehead one last time, and rode away toward the mountains without looking back. Winter deepened over the following weeks, bringing snow that transformed the valley into a white wonderland. Silas worked his forge, taking on the steady stream of work that kept him busy from dawn to dusk. May grew bigger and stronger, learning to laugh and to recognize Silas's voice, reaching for him when he came near. The town embraced them completely. The Odells brought dinner several times a week. Emma Brennan continued to visit daily, though May was beginning to take bottles now and would soon be weaned entirely. Reverend Price stopped by to check on them, and even crusty old Chester the drunk would occasionally leave firewood on their porch without saying a word. Marcus Garrett disappeared from the territory. Some said he'd gone to Denver, others claimed he'd headed to California. A few whispered that the territorial marshal's investigation had found enough evidence to issue warrants, and Garrett had fled before they could be served. Whatever the truth, His departure left Ridgeway feeling lighter, as if a dark cloud had lifted. 6 months passed in a blur of work and growth and the slow building of something that felt like family. When Silas returned to Judge Caldwell's court to finalize May's adoption, it was almost anticlimactic. The papers were signed, the judge gave his approval, and May Wynn officially became May Rowe. "Congratulations," Morrison said afterward, shaking Silas's hand. "You're officially a father." "I became her father the night I found her," Silas said, looking down at May in his arms. She was 8 months old now, starting to pull herself up on furniture, babbling in a language only she understood. "This just makes it legal." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing wildflowers to the mountain meadows. Silas stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. May sat beside him in a small chair he'd made, gnawing on a wooden toy and making happy sounds. "You know what, May?" Silas said, picking her up and settling her on his hip. "I came here looking for something I thought I wanted. A wife, a partner, a simple life. But I found something better. I found you." May giggled and grabbed his beard, pulling hard enough to make him wince. He laughed and gently disentangled her fingers, kissing her small hand. "Your mama made a choice that night," he continued, knowing she was too young to understand but needing to say it anyway. "She chose your life over her own comfort. She trusted that someone would find you, someone who'd love you like you deserved to be loved. And somehow, by grace or luck or fate, that someone was me." The mountains stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, Claire was building a new life, writing letters to her daughter that Silas saved carefully in a box for when May was old enough to read them. Somewhere out there, Marcus Garrett was facing whatever consequences awaited him. And somewhere out there, the future was unfolding in ways none of them could have predicted. But here, now, on this porch overlooking the valley, there was just a father and daughter watching the sunset together. A blacksmith who'd learned that the strongest things he'd ever made weren't forged from iron, but from love and commitment and showing up every day, no matter how hard it got. "We're going to be all right," Silas told May, holding her close as the stars began to appear overhead. "More than all right. We're going to be happy. We're going to build a life here, you and me. And someday, when you're grown, you'll look back and know that you were loved. That's all that really matters in the end, not blood or law or circumstances, but love." May yawned, her head dropping to rest against his shoulder. Silas carried her inside, moving through the evening routine they'd developed over the past months. He changed her and fed her, and sang the lullaby Mrs. Odell had taught him, his rough blacksmith's voice somehow finding gentleness for this child who'd changed everything. When May finally fell asleep, Silas sat in the rocking chair by her cradle and watched her breathe. The cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the small sounds of home, the crackle of the fire, the tick of the clock Paul had given them, the soft sigh of May's breathing. This was what happiness felt like, Silas realized. Not some grand adventure or romantic ideal, but this simple, profound peace, the knowledge that he'd been needed and had risen to meet that need, the certainty that May was safe and loved and his. He thought about the letter he'd received that morning, not from Clara this time, but from his old apprentice in Missouri. The young man had written asking for advice about the smithy, about life, about whether he should take a chance on something that seemed risky but might be worth it. Silas had already written his reply, but now he thought about adding one more line. Something about how the best things in life were usually the ones you never saw coming. Something about how love wasn't always what you expected, but it was always what you needed if you were brave enough to accept it. But maybe those were lessons each person had to learn for themselves. Maybe you couldn't really understand what it meant to choose love over convenience until you'd stood at that crossroads yourself and felt the weight of the decision. All Silas knew was that he'd arrived in Colorado looking for a mail-order bride and found instead an abandoned baby and a purpose he'd never known he was missing. He'd found a community willing to stand with him. He'd found courage he didn't know he possessed. And he'd found that family wasn't always about blood or law or conventional paths. Sometimes it was just about showing up and refusing to let go when life handed you something precious and unexpected. The fire burned low. The night deepened around the cabin, and in her cradle, May Rose slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that her father was near, that she was loved, that she was home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The forge needed repairs. Several people in town had projects waiting, and May was growing so fast that she'd need new clothes soon. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight, there was just this moment, this peace, this perfect, hard-won happiness that had begun with an empty house and an abandoned baby and a man who'd chosen to stay when everything told him to walk away. Silas Rowe had crossed a continent to find a new life, and he'd found one, just not the one he'd expected. He'd found something better. He'd found the life he was always meant to live, the daughter he was always meant to raise, the love he was always meant to give. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.